Utah's redistricting fight continues as a judge selected a congressional map that some are calling extremely partisan, prompting the state legislature to take action. But a bigger question that keeps getting missed is who should be choosing Utah's congressional district boundaries?
I really think we need to get back to the Constitution, and in that sense, going back to it is the best way forward.
On this episode, we sit down with two experts to unpack the political and constitutional ramifications of what just happened, including covering new survey data that shows what Utah voters actually want. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. This year, Sutherland Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary, thanks to all those who support the work we do for Utah and our great nation. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the ongoing debate here in Utah over the redistricting process for Utah's congressional boundaries. And to give us some updates and make sense of some of the news we've been seeing lately on this issue, I'm excited to welcome into our virtual studio Taylor Morgan with Morgan May Public Affairs. Taylor, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
And joining us in the room is Bill Duncan, our Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow. Bill, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you both for being here because even at the time of this recording, there has been a lot of development recently on this issue. This has kind of been a months or I guess years-long issue that's been debated and discussed here in Utah, the legislative level, the judicial level, and I really want to have a conversation to help our audience make sense of this in a way that they can be more informed as they're talking about this issue with others, as they're seeing news coverage and the focus on the Constitution that's being important and these process questions. And so with all of that, Taylor, if I can start with you, maybe just kind of give us your overall thoughts on kind of where things stand. And I'm really thinking, how did we end up here where we have an instance where a judge, Judge Gibson, ultimately was one who selected a congressional map that's now sort of the focal point of this debate. Just give us your perspective on the latest developments on this issue.
Wow, Nick, where to start? I mean, we are really today even following right on the heels of a press conference held by Utah's legislative leadership announcing a special session for December 9th, during which the Utah legislature will consider a few different options as they continue the battle over redistricting here in Utah. You know, I want to be careful that I'm sharing my opinion here, but I think I have some facts behind me. And my opinion, Nick, is that this map chosen by Judge Gibson is, in my opinion, the most egregious case of partisan gerrymandering in modern history. And I say that because we have a district now that is, on paper at least, 52% Democratic voters, when here in the state of Utah statewide, only 14% of all registered voters in Utah are Democrats. In Salt Lake County, only 22% of all registered voters are Democrats. Yet we now have the first congressional district that packs the most progressive, the most liberal and democratic portions of all of Utah into one congressional district. That is, now, Bill, you can correct me here because it's not often I get to say things like this with a constitutional fellow looking over my shoulder. So jump in if I'm wrong. But in my opinion, not being an attorney nor a constitutional expert or fellow, Bill, but in my eyes, this is an egregious example of partisan gerrymandering, the very thing that Proposition 4 promised voters it would fight. Back then in 2018, and I was close to Proposition 4 into better boundaries. I've been directly or indirectly close to this organization since its inception back in 2016. At that time, Prop 4 was sold to Utah voters promising a fair map drawing process, fair redistricting, input from an independent redistricting commission, all with the goal of generating more fair, more competitive elections. Fast forward to today, I believe Prop 4 has done the exact opposite of what it promised voters it would accomplish.
Taylor, can I follow up with you on that? And then, Bill, I want to bring you in on the constitutional side, as Taylor mentioned. But, Taylor, that seems to be a critical point that, at least in my view, I don't think is getting enough discussion in the news coverage, that even the folks who have been frustrated with Utah's congressional boundaries, I know there are various arguments on different sides of that issue, but for the folks who feel frustrated about the way the boundaries have been in the past, the arguments that I hear most often is that the broad principle we should all be pushing for are more competitive districts. And obviously you group like communities together, and I know there are a slew of guidelines that are intended to be followed when going through that process. But kind of to your point is that even just from a good governance, good election policy standpoint, there's a very good argument to make that competitive districts help politics to be better, because then you're trying to persuade the middle rather than pushing to the extremes. Is that sort of the correct conception of what the arguments for a redistricting process have been in Utah? And then again, apply that to kind of where we've landed, at least so far.
Yeah, I think you really hit it spot on there, Nick. And I can speak to this as someone who has devoted my career to one single goal, and that is improving voter participation in Utah's elections. I have put all of my career right in that effort. And, here we have, well, let me back up. We spend a lot of time fixated on the frustrations around the first district and how that is a partisan gerrymander. However, the problem is now statewide. We have 4 congressional districts that are not even remotely competitive. We have 3 R plus 40 to 50 Republican congressional districts, and we have 1 very, very Democratic district. None of those districts are going to be competitive at all when it comes to November. And so, exactly as you mentioned, Nick, we're going to now have 4 members of Congress in Utah that are going to ignore the middle. They're going to ignore the center because they will spend all of their time and attention and energy and resources messaging to the fringe extremes within their party because of how these districts are drawn. The center, the middle, you and I, the rest of those Utah voters that lived somewhere between the extremes of the parties, we will not have a voice or a say in our congressional members. That is a huge, huge problem as a consequence of the map chosen by Judge Gibson.
Bill, Taylor mentioned kind of the constitutional angle, and thanks, Taylor, for that kind of political breakdown, because again, this is one of those issues that maybe is not uncommon these days, but I think 3 things kind of blend together, multiple things kind of blend together, where, again, from what I see or what I hear, most folks debating this or arguing this that are on the sort of the pro side of this new map are framing it in terms of political outcomes. Well, as Taylor, you mentioned some of the stats. You said there's 14% of Utahns are Democrats, 22% of Salt Lake County are Democrats. So some have said, well, Democrats need representation in Congress. And in my view, it's almost like they're pushing for a gerrymander to create a safe blue district. And so there's the sort of the political debate that's happening, which, of course, the political outcomes are things that should be debated. But Bill, you've written about and spoken about extensively, you've been on the show talking about this, that a missing piece of this is the Constitution. And again, as also a non-attorney, non-constitutional fellow like you are, to me, it seems that before we even should be having a political conversation, we first need to answer the constitutional question. Can you answer that for us, just so the audience understands how we should be thinking about this?
I can try, at least. And it's a great question. I don't know that there's a lot of stock to put in the word fellow. I don't know. I'm not never quite sure what that means in the title. But well, so what I think it's important to sort of think about this from a very basic perspective. What does the Utah Constitution say about who decides what legislative districts will be? That's an actual really easy question, because the language is pretty sparse. It says the legislature shall divide the state into legislative districts, or into districts for election purposes. So in a way, that's simple. And it tells us who cannot, draw the legislative districts. It can't be unelected people, it can't be advocacy groups, it can't be the courts. It has to be the legislature. One thing I think that's important to think about related to that is that there must be a reason, or well, let me say this differently. There's a great value that promotes, and that is that decisions about legislative districts, about voting, will always have a tie to elected officials. So that means there's always a tie to voters. And that's prioritized. At the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court has held that the question of how legislative districts are decided is non-justiciable, meaning the courts have no role to, at the federal level at least, in determining how whether or not a particular map is going to be a good map or a bad map, even though people sue and they say, oh, it's not fair. And I think that's wise because the Constitution doesn't give these other branches authority to think about that. Now, having said that, it's also important to think about, so if one of the values that division of power serves is a link and accountability to voters, what do voters want, and how can they have that sort of carried into effect through the law when the decision making is pretty clear? I mean the line of authority to make that decision is clear. I think one answer, of course, is they can vote for legislators who are responsive to their concerns. I think, and there's more they can do too. They can, they can, like with Proposition 4, they can suggest that the legislature prioritize certain values over others. One of the things that seems clear for me as an outsider a little bit to this issue, because gerrymandering is not, borders aren't all that interesting. The Constitution really is, from my perspective. But it appears that one of the biggest concerns most people have is that this decision should be made on factors other than partisanship. And so, in other words, we shouldn't be looking to say, wow, we need more, we need the map to consistently deliver either Republican or Democrat results. And I think that's probably consistent with the expectations of the framers of the Utah Constitution, who were not wanting to sort of promote one party or the other. And it's interesting to me that the constitutional system allowing the legislature connected to the people who are holding them accountable is more likely to produce that result than the system we have that we're looking at currently, where it appears that some advocacy groups and some judges, whether that's intentional or not, I certainly am not arguing it's intentional, but have created a map that seems almost to focus entirely on partisanship, and in the name of fairness, which I think most people see as a procedural thing, that we're not trying to tip the balance in favor of any particular group or interest. We've actually done the opposite and said, well, okay, we've got one party here, we've got one party here. Let's make sure each gets a fair share of seats. And that's exactly what I think voters never wanted to see happen. And I don't think the Constitution is designed to create that result. But that's where we are, and so that should shape our response to what's happening currently.
Bill, a quick follow-up, and then we do need to take a break, but when we come back from the break, there's some new survey data we have from Sutherland Institute that I want to share and ask you both to respond to. But Bill, you mentioned this idea of sort of what voters want. And as I mentioned, we'll get into some of the survey data that helps answer some of that in the next segment. But I want to ask, because again, the arguments I heard, if I can kind of sort of channel devil's advocate, they're not necessarily persuasive to me, but this is what people are concerned about, at least the folks on the other side of this, that it seems like there is a perception among voters, some voters at least, that what people actually want, what voters want, is the crux of the debate. Because there are some who say, well, wait a minute, why do we even have ballot initiatives like Prop 4 if the legislature can change those after the fact, or if the legislature does something else? And I can understand that angst, that frustration, but can you put that into context, either, how we are supposed to act through our legislative representatives as well, or through the lens of the Constitution? Just help respond to someone out there who says, well, I want the people's will to be manifested, and if ballot initiatives like Prop 4 are not able to be successful the way these folks maybe anticipate, help put that into the legal, legislative, constitutional context properly.
That's a great question, and a fair concern, a fair thing to raise, because of course we want government to be responsive to people. The way that the framers of the Utah Constitution intended for that to happen, or the way they created for that to happen. So I'm not talking about their subjective intent, but just kind of what they wrote down is that. They ensured that those decisions would be made by people who have to live around and be accountable at pretty regular intervals to the people who they're representing, people who have these strong opinions. Now, in order to sort of expand the ability of voters to push legislators in a way that they feel is important, we also have a ballot initiative measures that allow for the voters to say, look, we're talking to our legislators, we're voting in certain ways, but we want to stress that this is a particular result we want. That is, and that's a valuable. Many of the Western states have taken that approach, and it can be a powerful backstop when it appears to voters that their representatives are not responding to them. But having said that, we always have to maintain the accountability issue, so the Constitution, in allowing both for the legislature to have power to make laws, but also for the people to directly make some laws, is to allow them to kind of be in a dialogue with each other. We didn't like the way you went with that. We're going to repeal that law that the legislature created, or you haven't done this even though we wanted to. We're going to promote that ballot measure, but there has to always be some deference to the reality that the legislature has to make these final decisions, and there's a good reason for that. And I think this sometimes gets missed in the process. The legislature has to make decisions with values of consensus, compromise, discussion. Ballot initiatives, court decisions are entirely different in terms of what we're trying to do. The ballot initiatives, for instance, are to propose ideas. A kind of a one chance to sort of get a megaphone and say, pay attention, but they can be influenced by a lot of different factors that may tamp down the values of things like consensus, compromise. Judges shouldn't be involved in that question at all, because they're supposed to look at the existing law and just apply it in circumstances as it's essentially written, as is the meaning that it would have for people, an informed person reading that text. So there's a place for all of the branches, and there's a place for the people's initiative power. It's an important place. There's a place for legislators. But if we understand better why the system is divided the way it is, I think we can see that we've got a great system that should be respected and can produce great results, even though it may take some time, and we may need to be patient as we watch for that process to play out.
Bill, one really fast follow-up. Producer Spencer is going to get mad at me for making this segment too long, but I think this is important because I've heard you make this point before, and I just want to capture and ask you to correct or quantify this in a way that our listeners can remember absolutely. Because again, this redistricting debate is a manifestation of the broader debate about the legislature's role versus the people's role through ballot initiatives, and kind of when those two things can coexist, if they can coexist. So if that's sort of the crux of the bigger debate, isn't it correct that nowhere in the Utah Constitution is there language that says that one is greater than the other, meaning that a law passed via ballot initiative or a law passed via the legislature are both just laws, that in the same way a bill cannot bind future legislatures, that whatever is enacted in law is subject to amendment by either a future ballot initiative or a future legislature. I just feel like that component is missed all the time, and that seems important to me.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I that really is critical. And again, it's worth thinking about why. What value does that promote? It promotes a continuing discussion, promotes the ability to say, well, we tried this, and it didn't work so well. And we see that all the time. I mean, look at so many other states where there's some kind of new idea comes along and tons of funders get behind it, and they go, and I'm from California, so I'll maybe pick on California. They go to voters, and they have a sophisticated ad campaign. They come up with an idea, but then in a couple of years, it's unmanageable. And now what do? Our system is much more responsive to the reality that occasionally we're going to need to make a change, or we need to consider something else. I feel like the legislature in this particular instance was trying to be responsive, maybe not perfectly, because we're never perfect about these things, but trying to be responsive to the concerns that voters raised in the ballot initiative, even if they felt there needed to be some adjustments. And I think that's the way the process works, and that's good. That's positive.
Well, and if I can jump in really quickly here, Bill, you're absolutely right. And in fact, we know that the year after Proposition 4 passed on the ballot back in 2018, the very following legislative session, the sponsors of Prop 4 linked arms with legislative leadership at a press conference and together celebrated a legislative compromise that improved, refined, and protected the Prop 4 language that had passed on the ballot. So even the sponsors behind the litigation at one time stood with the legislature and supported legislative leaders in amending the law that they had passed via initiative because of what Bill just explained so well. There's always going to be a need to amend and alter and create laws here in Utah, and that is why we have a legislature that meets every year to do it.
Thanks, Taylor. And the thing that comes to mind to me when you're saying that is that legislation is an iterative process, meaning as a people, as the legislative body here, we tinker, we refine, and that's an ongoing process that happens over time. It's not binary. I think our political and policy discussions these days, so many voters out there are conditioned to view it as binary, us versus them, this versus that. You're on this team or that team, whereas true legislative processes and discourses are, again, it's coalitions, it's finessing, it's tinkering and improving over time. And that's not sexy. That's not exciting in our social media or media environment. But it goes back to the sort of civic reminder that you both are giving us that that's how good policy gets done. So I wanted that segment to go a little longer, obviously, just because there's some really important things in there. But let's take a quick break, because when we come back, we have some brand new survey data. We went and asked Utah voters what do they actually think about all of this when it comes to who decides the congressional boundaries here in the state of Utah. So we'll dive into that, ask you both to respond. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sidelined Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sidelined provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sidelinedinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to continue our conversation with Taylor Morgan and Bill Duncan about redistricting here in Utah. First, remind you all, if you like what you're hearing, visit us at defendingideas.org, or wherever you're watching or listening, subscribe, search for Defending Ideas wherever you watch and listen, and click that subscribe button. Taylor and Bill, I want to share, so we have some brand new survey data from Sidelined Institute that is really trying to help answer what do voters actually want when it comes to these kinds of things. So I want to share some of these findings and ask you both to respond to them, and then see how do we sort of acknowledge these preferences as stated by voters in survey data with what the Constitution says, what the law says. So here's what we found. Again, this is a statewide survey of Utah voters. I'm just going to read from this. We'll include the link to this new article in the show notes as well. Voters clearly believe that those they elect, not judges, should decide congressional district boundaries. A majority of Utah voters either think that bodies elected by the people, 35%, or state-level elected officials, 21%, should be primarily responsible for congressional maps. By comparison, only 8% of Utah voters believe judges should be choosing maps. And I want to share also on the legislature specifically that when respondents were asked directly, should the legislature have a role in redrawing district maps, 60% of Utah voters said yes, the legislature should have some role. 40% said no, the legislature should have no role. I'll leave to statisticians smarter than I to figure out how those two things align or don't align. Just for our audience, sometimes the way survey questions are asked, public perception about different terms can impact results at times, but it still gives you a sense that there's an overwhelming majority of folks, regardless of how you ask the question, says, yeah, the legislature is the entity that should be involved with this. And then lastly, of the people who said, yes, the legislature should have a role on redistricting, of those, 45% believe that legislators should pick from maps approved by a commission. 40% believe legislators should set district boundaries with an advisory commission to assist. And 15% believe that the legislature should have sole decision-making authority. So I kind of throw that all at both of you, and I would just love to hear your response. Taylor, let's maybe start with you, because you've worked at the center of this, again, as you've talked about trying to make our election process better, increase participation. When you hear those survey results about what Utah voters think and want out of the process, what strikes you?
A couple takeaways. The first thing that strikes me is that very clearly a vast majority of Utah voters do believe that their elected officials should be the ones drawing maps. Of course, as we talked about last segment, that is what the Utah Constitution says. The Utah Constitution gives the sole authority to draw maps to the Utah legislature. The other thing that really strikes me, Nick, is just what you mentioned, kind of how questions are asked, public opinion. I will say that the Utah legislature has taken a beating in the press. Now, some of it has been deserved. And I have been forthright with legislative leadership when I have told them that I think they have chosen a lot of the wrong battles at the wrong time, and they have lost most of them throughout this redistricting battle. I think the legislature has been unnecessarily antagonistic at some points during this redistricting fight, and I think that has generated some very negative perceptions in the press and amongst the public. So I think that there's a reason why if you use the word legislature when you ask voters that question, it elicits a little bit of a different, more negative response. But still, even then, clearly, a vast majority of voters do agree and do understand that the Constitution gives that power to our state elected officials.
Bill, what are your thoughts? I mean, especially looking at it through the lens of your expertise of there are things that the Constitution says that the language is pretty clear. The legislature shall draw the boundaries. But when you hear kind of that breakdown of even just what voters think, this is just asking them, what's your preference? Do the two things seem aligned? Is there some education that needs to happen as far as what voters might think is ideal versus constitutional language, or does it speak to the need for any other reforms?
On the simplest questions, the data or that survey data seems to be completely consistent with the Constitution. The elected officials, whether we're thinking about the legislature or not, the Constitution says the legislature, and they are our elected officials, should make that decision. And it's not for judges to select maps or to create a sense of what they think may be partisan fairness. So I think that's a really good sign when there's an alignment between what voters want and the constitutional principles involved, then we avoid a crisis. So I think that's really positive. I think it would. I love what Taylor said. I think that it's really helpful to just maybe push a little bit about, well, what does that mean? And then to think again about why we want that. I mean, we want it because I want to be able to go a couple blocks over where my state legislator lives and say, maybe not to his house, poor guy, but to communicate with him in some way. Here's what I'm concerned about. Here's what I see, and to be responsive rather than a convoluted system where the representatives of the people are completely cut out of the process and they just wait for someone else, either a highly motivated group or a highly motivated group going to court, make those decisions. That I think it's good that seems to be off the table for most people.
Well, let's take another quick break because in our final segment, I want to talk about what's next and hear from both of you what should be next. What should we do as voters? What should the legislature do? What should the courts do? And I kind of I'll tease everyone with this question that this is what I want to start the next segment with is when we look at the results of the survey data, when we look at the constitutional text and all the principles that you both are outlining, what takeaways should policymakers draw from that to inform what they do moving forward, and what takeaways should we as voters draw from that to inform how we even discuss these issues so that we can approach it from more of a constitutional and civic literacy standpoint as we're engaging in these debates moving forward. So we'll get into that right after this break. Again, this is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're going to jump back into the conversation about the redistricting fight here in Utah, but want to remind you to subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you watch or listen. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows. Click subscribe. You can also find us at defendingideas.org. Get access to all of that and more. Again, defendingideas.org or wherever you get your shows. So Taylor and Bill, to kind of finish things off, I want to sort of give some insights to our audience about, it's one thing to hear about these debates and these problems, say, well, that there's a lot of, mistakes that have been happening on this issue, but let's give them sort of an affirmative argument. Maybe to start, I want to ask, how should this issue have been dealt with as a state here in Utah? Let's maybe start there. So Taylor, when you look back at the last months or years of these kinds of issues being debated, what advice would you give to say, well, in the future, guys, here's how we should be addressing these kinds of things?
Well, what is so hard about this, Nick, is that the Constitution is really very clear. And Bill has explained that so well throughout, our show here today. However, unfortunately, politics has completely derailed this process and gotten us away from the Utah Constitution with how we ended up with the maps we have today. And in my opinion, in my experience, this all can really be tied back to how the Utah legislature engaged politically and with the public when it came to the map drawing process. That the way they went about this, they completely disregarded and disrespected the input from the Independent Redistricting Commission. Now, if I had been advising them at that time, I would have encouraged them to embrace the input, to welcome the suggestions from the commission and from the public. But because the legislature was seen as being very dismissive and very uninterested in that kind of input, I think that set the stage for the litigation that was filed just a few years later. The outcome of the redistricting process certainly created a bit of an optics opportunity for the plaintiffs in that case, right? Dividing Mill Creek in four districts in a neighborhood there, that's not a problem if you really look at how redistricting is done. You have to divide Salt Lake County somewhere just because it's so large population-wise. But the optics of how the legislature went about redistricting and the optics and the politics of the perception among Utah voters really set the stage for the litigants to have a successful case.
Bill, looking back, is there anything that you would have done differently if you could have influenced this process from the beginning?
Well, there's probably many good reasons why I'm not the one in charge. But having said that, I would put a lot of emphasis on the role of the Utah Supreme Court. I think that's where things went drastically wrong. The Utah Supreme Court, ruled in 2024 that legislatures could not amend ballot initiatives. You have a ballot initiative that was passed reflecting the intention of the people to get the attention of the legislature. But the court treated it without any, as far as I can see, legal justification for doing that as a kind of like a quasi-constitutional amendment. I mean, that it's sort of, it can't be changed, it can't be touched. And that undermined the value of what the Constitution had done. It prevented the people and the legislature from interacting with each other and getting a better process. For instance, I think the legislature has said that they're concerned by some of the kind of vague standards that were in Proposition 4, and that's a reasonable concern. And they could respond to that by making amendments, and did, and that seemed to be going well. But the challenge is then the court said, well, no, actually, there's no role for the legislature to play. They have to leave it to us, the courts, to determine whether what the legislature does is in the spirit of what voters wanted. That insertion of the court into the process was really distorted the process dramatically, and it's prevented, I think, better decisions. And probably, my personal opinion, probably contributed to what Taylor described, where the different parties are kind of ignoring each other and not working together constructively, as I think the sharing of power in the constitutional system was intended to promote.
I'm so glad Brill brings that up, because I have direct knowledge of this. And at the time, Proposition 4 was those standards, right, that should govern the redistricting process. Those standards were written to be intentionally vague so that any future redistricting process could be subject to challenge via litigation. That was the intent of the sponsors at the time with those standards. The legislature knew that was the case. They recognized that. That's why we got SB 200, the compromise bill, in the session just following passage. It was to clarify those standards to avoid going down a path of litigation every time the legislature tried to draw maps. And so Bill's exactly right. That the state Supreme Court ruling last year, really creating a super law, a super category of statute, a statute passed by initiative, that is hugely problematic, right? Constitutionally. I'm, again, not a lawyer. I just pretend to be one sometimes. I have used Utah's initiative process here in Utah many times. It is something I truly believe in. But more importantly, I believe that any language passed by initiative should be subject to improvements, refinements, changes by our constitutionally elected legislature.
Well, for both of you guys, as we round out this episode, these conversations to me are so important, because this gets to the core of what I think sometimes is frustrating for voters on either side of the issue, but also to these core questions of just how we govern ourselves, how we make decisions, and weaving in the politics of it, the policy, the constitutional language. It just feels like one of those really important conversations to get right as a state. And in that context, I want to ask you both as we wrap up here, and Bill, I'll start with you, then Taylor will give you the last word. I want to ask you both, if you were advising leadership here in Utah, if you were advising the court system, the legislature, and just voters generally about, okay, here's what we do next. Here's how we should fix all of this. Here's a good process for this moving forward that complies with the Constitution, that, and includes in some way what voters have said they want, and with the legislative role. Is there any way to sort of tie all this together in a good, constructive process moving forward? Bill, we'll start with you, and then Taylor, ask you to answer the same question.
There's probably lots of things, and Taylor, I'm sure, will give a better answer, but I'll start with the court will have the chance to reconsider its prior decision because the legislature is going to be, as we understand, appealing Judge Gibson's decision to them in a timely way. And so I think this is a chance to pull back on the kind of broad interpretation of the Constitution and stick to their role. I think that will remove one of the distorting factors out of this discussion. But then I think it's helpful for voters and the legislature, like Taylor's described, to think carefully about what we learn from the structure of our state constitution. It's wise. It's measured, and what do we lose when we jettison that carefully created structure? So I think for instance, just as a simple example, Voters need to remember that elected officials that they want to make these decisions include their legislators, and they need to be involved. And more individuals involved in that process of selecting elected officials is likely to create a better result in future discussions and make for more responsiveness. So I think that would be just maybe some relatively simple.
Taylor, close us out. What's the path forward on this issue for Utah, in your view?
That's the question, Nick. And I wish I had a really clear slam dunk answer for you. I know in their press conference this morning, legislative leaders, followed, of course, by Governor Spencer Cox, proposed some possibilities. This is a bit of a kitchen sink approach here. They're going to try a number of different things, anything they can to try to address this issue. I would maybe issue a word of caution with our elections. Anytime it comes to Utah's election process, I think we need to be very careful with monkeying around with deadlines and requirements. Utah has the gold standard when it comes to elections. No process is perfect. Ours isn't perfect, but our elections are really well administered. They're trusted. Our voter participation rate in Utah has increased dramatically in the last decade. So I would caution legislators against messing around much with the election process or with timelines. Really, my advice would be that the best path forward is to do, frankly, exactly what we're doing here right now, which is to ground all of our conversations, all of our rhetoric, and all of the debate about this issue in the Constitution. We need to get back to the Utah Constitution and turn from just the partisan politics about gerrymandering and start communicating more with voters about what the Constitution says, why it says that. And for that reason, I would seriously consider a constitutional amendment put forward to the Utah voters to further clarify this issue over redistricting. I really think we need to get back to the Constitution. And in that sense, going back to it is the best way forward.
Well, we will have to leave it there. This is a big issue, and so I'm really grateful for the extra time that you both have lent to all of us here at Defending Ideas. We'll, of course, watch this issue and continue to weigh in as it progresses in whatever ways we can constructively on this show to try and help folks make sense of it and be better equipped to talk about these issues in the principally grounded way that you both have articulated. So, again, Bill Duncan, thank you, and Taylor Morgan, thank you both for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks so much.
We're going to take a final break before we leave you with the talking points to close out this discussion. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas, and special thanks again to Taylor Morgan, Bill Duncan for joining us on this timely conversation. There's a central theme that stands out to me from this discussion, and I think it's something that you and I can use and should use as we talk with others about the issue of redistricting as it progresses. At the core of the redistricting debate, I think, is a simple but important principle. We should ground all our conversations about this issue in the text of the Utah Constitution, while also being able to be responsive to what Utah voters want. So every time you or I talk about this issue with friends, with neighbors, or community members, we should bring the conversation back to two questions. Number one, what does the Constitution actually say about the redistricting process? Our preferred political outcomes or our views of good politics or election policy must be filtered first through the constitutional text. And then second, if that needs some clarification, some improvement, a constitutional amendment is the appropriate process. We also shouldn't ignore what voters state that they want. And our survey data we talked about on the show shows that voters want elected officials, not judges, deciding what Utah's congressional boundaries look like. Starting there, I think, grounds the debate in both representative legitimacy and constitutional authority. strengthening Utah's redistricting process doesn't have to be hyper-partisan, doesn't have to be a fight. We can build a model that I think actually respects the separation of powers and reflects the public's expectations appropriately without turning judges into map makers and while staying anchored to the Constitution. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows, and please share this episode with a friend or family member or coworker who may find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.